Hello, everyone. This is Professor Bean, of course, speaking to you from my living room couch, which is not where I expected to be telling you about the new wave in Hollywood in the 1960s and 1970s, but circumstances being what they are, here we are, and we will do our best to see things through until the end of the semester. So, the topic for us to tackle today is yet another period of change in Hollywood. And you might be noticing a pattern here. Hollywood forms into this gigantic colossus of an industry back in the 19 teens and 1920s. And then it feels like every 15, 20 years after that, they hit a period of tumultuous change. And that is more or less exactly how the industry has played out ever since then. We had discussed the arrival of sound and other technological changes like colorization in the late 1920s and early 1930s. That is a leap forward, not something that causes a setback for Hollywood. That the setbacks begin though after World War II, as we had discussed a couple of weeks ago, with the rise of television, the regulatory challenges, especially the famous Paramount decisions that made the movie studios sell off their theater chains, and then Hollywood responded with big spectacles, with stuff you can't see on TV, and by focusing, at least on the studio front, on distribution as the primary way of making money. All that sets the stage by the end of the 1950s for the old way of doing things in Hollywood to not completely fall apart, but Hollywood in 1970 is a wildly different place than it was in 1960, and it's a revolution that happens pretty quickly, like blink of an eye almost. So part of this is very similar to what happens with French cinema during their new wave. There is a young rising generation whose talent is pushing aside the older voices, the older hands on the wheel, if you will. And it's worth noting that a lot of the people who were still in charge of things in Hollywood by the end of the 1950s were people who had established their names maybe all the way back in the 1920s. Jack Warner, the president of Warner Brothers Pictures, he founded that company back in the 1920s. He was president of Warner Brothers Pictures until the 1960s. And that's an enormous amount of cinema history that happens in just this one guy's presidency of that studio. And the same is true for the filmmaking talent. You have directors like John Ford, who directed Stagecoach. He starts making films in Hollywood back in the mid 1920s, if I'm recalling correctly, and he's still making studio films until about 1970, but clearly a career that stretches nearly a half century. There are going to be people who are into middle age who were born, after John Ford had first made a movie like The Iron Horse. Same is true of other big names, of course. Alfred Hitchcock, Howard Hawks, the old movie stars like John Wayne and Jimmy Stewart, Katharine Hepburn. All of them are still around, but they are the old guard, as it were. And so that means that there's a rising crop of people, still mainly men, who come in and start pushing aside the old guard. And they have a lot of help in doing that because of a couple of big changes in Hollywood. First of all, the business itself starts to transform in the 1960s, and it starts to transform at the top. Up until the 1960s, Hollywood studios had been independent businesses. I mentioned Jack Warner, still the president of Warner Brothers. It was just the Warner Brothers company. Like they sold stock, but that was their company. And there had been a lot of mergers, and some of the old studios had already disappeared. RKO goes out of business in the 1950s, so that old structure of the 5 majors and the 3 minors, that's already being thrown up in the air a little bit. What starts to change in the 1960s is that you see outside ownership. The studios themselves become just parts of larger corporate conglomerates. And oftentimes, it's corporate conglomerates that have no idea how to make movies. Paramount Pictures nearly goes bankrupt in the 1960s, and that's actually a part and parcel of this, if you'll give me the brief aside here. Part of the reason that studios have to get sold is because they nearly go bankrupt if they invest too much and something falls apart. 20th Century Fox produces a movie adaptation of Cleopatra in the early 1960s that was the most expensive movie ever made at that time. And it was the #1 movie of the year at the box office, and it still nearly bankrupted that film studio. It was just that expensive. Elizabeth Barton's salary and all it's a fiasco. And that happens a couple of other times during the decade. Paramount nearly went bankrupt because of an astoundingly bad idea. They made a Western mega musical called Paint Your Wagon, starring a French New Wave actress and Clint Eastwood. Like, Clint Eastwood is a famous Western actor, even by the late 1960s. He's another guy that's now been around a long time. But I encourage you to pause the video and to go to YouTube and look up Clint Eastwood singing I Talk to the Trees, one of the key emotional moments from Paint Your Wagon. Go ahead and do that. I'll give you a second here. So presuming you did that, holy cow, that's it's terrible. It's absolute shit. Yes, studios could have gotten through that in the past because they had all that revenue from their vertical integration. They had the production, the distribution, and the exhibition all locked down. But with the sale of the theater chains, that's not guaranteed anymore. At the end of block booking, not every movie is going to be a financial gain. And so busts at the box office could mean a bust of the entire studio. And so, for example, Paramount gets snapped up by Gulf Western, an oil company. What does an oil company know about running a movie studio? They just fling a couple of suits at it, hire a new executive team, and then the studio is left basically to its own devices. Warner Brothers is taken over by a company whose main business was owning parking lots and funeral homes. Okay. Even big grand studios, MGM, Metro Goldwyn Mayer, which had been the biggest, fanciest studio back in the 1930s, they were sold to an investor who didn't want to run a movie studio. He just wanted to be able to plaster the famous name MGM on the side of his casino in Las Vegas. He let the studio basically go out of business because he didn't care. He just wanted a name. And so that means, all the old hands who had kept that Hollywood system in place, even through those regulatory changes and the television revolution, they are dying, retiring, or just simply being replaced because they've been bought out or their company has been forced into bankruptcy. And so that means that there is a new power structure in Hollywood. Previously, it had been the executive staff of the studios that tended to be quite powerful back in the 1930s. Somebody like Irving Thalberg would have been the dictator of a studio lot, literally assigning people from producers and directors down to writers, actors. Every role would have just been Irving Thalberg says, do that. And you did that. That's gone by the 1960s. Instead, it's independent producers, some of them with exclusive deals at the studios, but oftentimes just purely selling to the highest bidder, the best deal, that sort of thing, who make their movies with outside funding. They go to banks, they go to investors, however they assemble their money. They make the movie themselves, and sometimes in conjunction with the studio, sometimes just selling it to a studio almost as a completed product. And so now that means the studio itself has lost a lot of power. It's just almost a name slapped onto the front. And you also see the rise in power of a new class in Hollywood: agents. Agents are the people who negotiate deals for producers, directors, writers, actors, everybody. And agents get a slice of those deals, pretty healthy slice in some ways, which makes them it makes it a very lucrative job, and it makes those people very powerful. Agents become the glue in the Hollywood power structure, and so I believe it's Warner Brothers winds up being bought by a talent agency. Like the people who put together the deals for the studio now own the studio. It's a complete role reversal from what it had been even a couple of years prior. And so the corporate culture itself is in chaos. If you know anything about popular culture back in the 1960s and 70s, I'm sure you're aware of just how monumentally chaotic and revolutionary that decade was as well. The production code that had existed for Hollywood up until the 1960s obviously was not set up to deal with that. And so a lot of movies just start ignoring it. They started doing that all the way back in the 1950s, but it becomes even more pronounced in the 1960s, to the point where the code itself, the self-censorship regulation the studios had created because of pressure from Catholic groups, from municipal authorities, it's no longer functioning. So it gets replaced by the ratings system that we have today. G is general audiences; anybody can go to see that movie. PG is parental guidance suggested. That means basically there's stuff in this that maybe is appropriate, maybe inappropriate for kids. We advise parents go along. There's no PG-13 at this time. That's not created until the 1980s. That was created because Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom terrified so many kids that the ratings board, the Motion Picture Association of America, decided, maybe that beating heart and the guy saying "Holly Mom," maybe you do have to be slightly older than 6 to see that scene. Anyway. So there's G, PG, there's R, which is restricted, which is supposed to mean you cannot see it at all without the being accompanied by somebody over 17, or you're over 17 yourself, and that brings more content freedom with it. You can curse more, you can talk about more controversial, complex topics. Nudity is allowed for the first time in 35 years or so, which has actually been something Hollywood was very mad about. European films had been featuring nude scenes for about 15 years. Hollywood could not, and so we were behind in the erotic appeal, I guess. The internet didn't exist yet, just in case you were curious. And then there's one more ratings category above rated R. There's rated X, which was supposed to be that nobody under 18 was allowed to see it at all, even if their parents thought they were old enough. Clearly, their parents are crazy hippies, and that's not acceptable. X-rated movies were relatively rare because there was such a association made with their adult content. Now, there are X-rated movies that are not just smut. There's actually an X-rated Best Picture winner. The Oscars gave their Best Picture of the Year award in 1969 to Midnight Cowboy, which is a deeply sad movie about a kid from the Great Plains who moves to New York to try and make it as a hustler, winds up becoming a male escort and falling in with a small-time thief. And the two of them just live this lonely, depressed, sick existence on the margins of society until the friend Rizzo dies in the back of a bus while they're riding to Florida. It's just a sad movie that happens to feature men trying to go at each other a little bit, like not much, but a little bit. But that's no longer a rating that exists because the porn industry kind of took it and co-opted it. There's this, you may be familiar, XXX is pornography. That was basically, well, if you think X-rated movies are titillating, I imagine what 3X's might suggest. Ooh. The X rating was eventually replaced with NC-17, which is still quite a rare thing. So content frees up quite a bit, and there's a couple of really famous movies that are examples of this towards the end of the 1960s. Maybe most famously in 1967, you see the release of Bonnie and Clyde, which is a gangster movie, but also features subplots of sex and sexuality, explicit violence. It is the kind of gangster movie that wouldn't have been possible even 10 years prior. And it seems to hit upon the sort of youth culture, the anti-authority feeling in the country. And by the end of the 1960s, like, Bonnie and Clyde are not hippies, but a lot of hippies saw them as heroes, if that makes a certain amount of sense. That's also the year a famous movie called The Graduate is released, which is all about a young man who has an affair with his neighbor's wife, because he has no idea what else to do with himself, and then he falls in love with that woman's daughter that he had the affair with, having sex with both of them, and then trying to break up her wedding. It's and this is a comedy. But it was a famous movie in its time for pushing past those boundaries that had been created. So the corporate culture is changing, popular culture is changing, Hollywood adapts to meet it, and that also means that there's a rising generation of new filmmaking talent, especially directors. These are people who grew up on movies. They have learned about the French New Wave. They've seen the movies of Godard and Truffaut, and they accept the auteur theory. They see themselves as authors of their work, and they imprint their personality onto these corporate products as much as they possibly can. There's a couple of names that break out in this time that are still very relevant today. Martin Scorsese is probably still the most active and most vibrant of these new Hollywood directors from the 1970s who break through in the 1970s. There's also Steven Spielberg is from that film school generation. Obviously, he is still one of the major figures in Hollywood history and Hollywood itself, even today. Others like Francis Ford Coppola basically have a really big 1970s. Francis Ford Coppola writes Patton, directs the first two Godfather movies, directs another amazing movie called The Conversation, and then completes the decade by creating the first great movie about the Vietnam War called Apocalypse Now. And he's kind of never made a good movie since then, in the 40 years since Apocalypse Now came out. But hey, that is a you got a whole career in like 9 years. Just go ahead and retire. There's other figures, including controversial ones today, notably Woody Allen and Roman Polanski. I can talk more about those figures if you want to, but both of them have been credibly accused of some pretty heinous sexual crimes. But they also make massively popular award-winning films like Annie Hall and Chinatown, genre-defining films in many ways. And in a lot of ways, these new Hollywood directors, they are still making Hollywood products in most ways. The Godfather is a great example of that. The Godfather is classic Hollywood cinema, but it embraces some of the new stylistic freedoms. It embraces some of those new content freedoms. And it's coming from people who had not been in the industry, at least not prominent in the industry, not part of the old guard. So even though it's old-fashioned movie making in a lot of ways, there's a lot of young blood in this new generation of Hollywood that starts to take over in the 1970s. And so the movies that you have to watch this week are probably going to look pretty radically different. The last Hollywood movie you watched was Singing in the Rain. Breathless was quite different than Singing in the Rain. The films you have on tap this week, very, very different as well. Taxi Driver could not be a further left-hand turn from Singing in the Rain if I had tried. And by the way, I included Taxi Driver. That was the main screening choice, just because if you liked Joker, uh, here is the version of that came out first and was good. Yeah. All right. That's all for now. I'll see you on Zoom if you have any questions.